Historical fiction is a genre of storytelling mostly untouched within gaming. For the longest time, only certain franchises such as Age of Empires, Civilization, Total War, Europa Universalis, Assassin's Creed, and Command & Conquer Red Alert were the exclusive forerunners using this storytelling skeletal framework. But with the release of Ghost of Tsushima in 2020 and Ghost of Yōtei this year, there's a new budding historical fiction franchise taking root, and unlike previous implementations of this narrative genre, Sucker Punch has limited their fictionalization of history to Japan, creating a sort of new age Nihon nostalgia, reminiscent of what Kurosawa did in the 50s. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and after 58 hours, I've completed Ghost of Yōtei 100%, and I've done so entirely on lethal difficulty, the highest level of challenge the game provides the player. Despite being tempted many times, I never lowered the difficulty during my playthrough. In this analysis, I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on Ghost of Yōtei's gameplay chops, difficulty design, platinum process, story, and historical value. Since I'm a month late to the conversation regarding this game, I'm not going to be limiting myself in regards to what I talk about, so this is your massive spoiler warning for any and all aspects of Ghost of Yōtei, including main progression revelations, gameplay mechanics, bosses, and side content offerings. Since there's so much to talk about, let's dive right in, shall we? The core gameplay of Ghost of Yōtei is quite similar to Ghost of Tsushima, which is exactly what should be expected from a direct sequel. Instead of sword stances, Yotei gives the player multiple melee weapons, such as a Yari, 2 katanas, Kusarigama, and Odachi. But these two systems essentially function the same way. This is actually one of the biggest letdowns of the game, as it would have added so much more depth to the title if these weapons functioned separately from the system in Tsushima, or at least if the two systems weren't so similar. Instead of depth, Yotei just adds on top of Tsushima's design, which is a consistent trope of video game development, of course. I just wish that this would have been more similar to what, say, Crash Bandicoot did to the first game in its franchise, or what Resident Evil 2 did to Director's Cut. There's a nuance here because it's not a bad system by any means, as Yotei's gameplay being bad would mean that Tsushima's is by extension, which just isn't true at all. What is missing from Tsushima is the way off-stance positions affected how the player interacted with enemies using equipment they couldn't counter. In Tsushima, the combination of counters and footsies for each stance allowed the player to still engage in fun dynamic encounters, whereas the same isn't necessarily true of Yotei. Shields are stalwart walls without the Kusarigama, and spears are oppressive tyrants without double katanas, which is not the sense I got from the gameplay in Tsushima. Even without the appropriate stances, the player is given more expressive, personal choice in how they want to engage with the enemy, on how to use the unique traits of each stance to their advantage. In Yotei, this gets better once the player gets the spirit special attack for each, which allows each weapon to be much more useful in situations where it's not the ideal selection, and when they get access to some of the more specific and unique weapon skills. For example, the Odachi is able to cover the fact that it's dreadfully slow because of the way it can counter red tier attacks, which are normally unblockable and uncounterable. The Yari gets more utility from the running sweep attack, which has a nice arc that can help push off unwanted enemy advancement while the player prioritizes their primary prey. And this spear also provides the player another crowd control tool with the leaping kick attack. The Kusarigama gets an attack following a roll while also having a god tier triple 360 spin attack, which is quite possibly the best tool for crowd control within the melee weapon space. The Wolf Blade, the single katana, is a unique weapon within how this gameplay system works. Because of the way that it is the weakness of other katana wielders, this is a significant aspect of Yotei's design, as it means the humble katana is always necessary in every engagement, which is not true of every other melee weapon in the game. Finally, the dual katanas have a uniquely useful trait with the way that they are able to attack and counter at the same time when used against spearmen. This aspect of the dual katana is the thing that makes the pair of weapons useful. Within the context of duels, there's actually a special aspect to this particular part of the dual katana's toolkit, as as a general rule, enemy combatants don't have recovery frames for failed attacks, unless they've been perfectly parried or dodged. At least, that's the way it is on lethal. Just for reference, everything I mention in this video is from the perspective of the lethal difficulty. It's not something I'm going to clarify again, so just keep that in mind, especially since the rules might be a bit different on lower difficulties. This impacts the way the dual katanas work in duels against Yari users, because boss tier enemies are able to recover and riposte in the middle of the player's combos. This led to many deaths where my opponent was able to get partially parried by the dual katana's heavy attack passive, and still counterattack quicker than it's possible for the player to actually respond without a perfectly honed lizard brain. The solution to this problem is that these heavy katana swings have to be staggered with a dodge. This seems to reset the opponent's targeting, essentially creating an infinite loop of impenetrable heavy attacks for as long as the enemy is using a Yari. However, certain high-profile duelists, such as Lord Saito, are able to enact attacks that are able to break out of this loop, sometimes leading to instant death. I found that this strategy worked far more often than it failed, so I began to just accept this possibility. These melee weapons are bolstered with a set of consumables and ranged weapons. The bows and bombs work essentially the same way they do in Tsushima, and the only difference with the Tanegashima is the way that it can punch through shields and armor, and often kills in one hit even on a body shot. The consumables are a bit more interesting, as the Oni oil is able to work around blocks and shields, giving a player that doesn't have all of the melee weapons unlocked yet a way to interact with the weapons they don't have a weakness for. Oni Flame becomes borderline useless in the late game, though it does have some use against duelists. All of the other quickfire weapons are incredibly useful as stunning agents, allowing the player to string together longer combos. The kunai, smoke bombs, tanzutsu, and metsubushi are all things I use to extend combos out of a perfect parry, which is what I use to defeat Takezo, Saito, and pretty much every difficult duel in the game. Disarming opponents and using their dropped weapons as an insta or near instant kill projectile is a nice addition to Yotei's gameplay, and very much reminded me of a similar mechanic in Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones. This mechanic is a key one on lethal because of the way it allows the player to essentially select which type of aggressor they don't want to deal with. For me, that would usually be shield guys, or those guys that have the double Kusarigama. I found both of those enemy types to be the most annoying and difficult to deal with throughout the entire game. Everything I've discussed so far can't be called bad gameplay. It's not particularly deep, but not every single game has to be in order to also be a good game. There is one aspect of Yotei's design that is the direct product of modern game design ideals, and is a big negative though, and that element is suck to target. Now, for those of you who don't know what this term means, suck to target refers to the way in which the player and enemies zip towards one another whenever they've begun an attack. This feature of game design existed before Sony exclusive games began using it, but it is such a key feature of Sony cinematic action game design that they can't really be separated. It's not always a bad thing, as games like the Batman Arkham series have used it to great effect in the past. From a casual gaming perspective, this is quite a useful element of design, as it ensures that the gamer will never feel unsatisfied with their actions, as they're almost assuredly going to hit any target they go after, and they won't need to prompt enemy units to be aggressive towards them. Now, Yotei doesn't really abuse this mechanic in terms of the player in this game. There were times where it seemed like I should have missed and I did hit, which makes me think that there is probably some amount of this that is implemented in favor of the player. But in terms of lethal difficulty, this element is a net negative for the player whenever the enemies use it, and boy howdy do they use it a lot. They are already hyper aggressive, and the inclusion of suck to target can deconstruct many of the game design elements present in Yotei. For example, rolling away from an enemy successfully usually means that the player gets a moment to breathe and ready themselves for the next offensive launched by the enemy. But partially because of suck to target, the lethal player will sometimes instead be killed in the middle of a roll by either the enemy they just evaded or another. The iframe for the roll runs out before the end of the roll itself, as it turns out, leading to a full roll sometimes being an instant death liability and an unpredictable one at that. You see, rolls are sometimes the only good way to evade certain combos, and because the player doesn't always get killed in the middle of one, it creates a sense of randomness to the gameplay that shouldn't exist in regards to evasive tactics. This is true outside of enemy mosh pits too, as duelists can also interrupt a player's roll by instantly recovering from the end of their combo and immediately starting another before the player gets a chance to complete their recovery frames. Because of the low punishment nature of Yotei, this is typically an annoyance that doesn't actually waste the player's time, but because of the way enemy encampments work, with how the player has to restart from the beginning upon death, sometimes the player does lose a good 5 to 10 minutes of progress from something they really can't plan for. Suck to target is actually my least favorite aspect of Yotei's design, and even though it would have definitely been harder to design this game without it, I do think the overall gameplay feel, flow, and construction of combat encounters would be massively better without suck to target being something the enemies can do. If a limiter were put into place, preventing the enemy from doing an attack while the player is in recovery frames, or making sure enemies actually have to recover from their own combos before beginning another onslaught, this whole issue with the gameplay would be fixed. Eventually, I began to not roll in situations where I could lose significant progress, instead utilizing the riskier perfect parries and dodges to ensure survivability. These are far less reliable, but since they provide the player true invincibility upon success, they are the ideal defensive tool. That is, they are outside of certain duels. I don't know if this is a glitch, but I found that Takezo the Unrivaled is actually able to strike the player while they are in the middle of their perfect dodge counterattack, a sacrosanct sacrament of safety, where the player is supposed to be invulnerable at least for that one attack. He's the only one I noticed being able to do this, so it may just be a quirk of his particular fight, or it could also be that I only noticed it there since Takezo kills in one single hit on lethal difficulty. The name of lethal to describe Yotei's hardest mode is pretty damn accurate, as death is literal frames away from the player at any given point. Every game needs a balance of difficulty and punishment to match the relative skill level of their target audience. In these terms, Ghost of Yōtei on Lethal is a game that demands damn near pixel-perfect parries, but it does so without punishing the player all too much for failure. Resetting to the start of a camp upon death is not bloat or tedium made manifest. It is important to have that punishment, otherwise the difficulty would lack teeth. Some camps have midpoint checkpoints, which is necessary when duels are included because of how easy it is to die in 1 or 2 hits within that gameplay context. I didn't talk about stealth systems in the previous section of the video because they work better in regards to this element of Yotei camps. Stealth is the player's best friend for these encounters because of the tenuous nature of Atsu's vitality. Just like in Tsushima, the player gets loads of tools to assist them in this regard, such as a wolf companion and the ability to assassinate multiple enemies at once. If the player is concerned about getting caught, they can quickly call out a challenge too, entering the showdown state, which comes directly beat for beat from Tsushima. In this state, the wolf will eventually be able to kill an additional target as well, meaning there are multiple ways in which the player is able to mitigate the difficulty of their infiltrations and invasions. Buildcraft is also a tool of challenge mitigation for the player, as certain armor sets buffs are better in certain contexts than others. There are armors that are better for stealth, and some that are better for melee mashes. By the end of my playthrough, I had 4 separate builds that I rotated between, each with nuanced parameters that would determine when I'd choose one over the others. This is great because Yotei is a game where the margin for failure gets tighter as the game progresses, meaning that by the end of the game, the player is expected to be perfect in order to succeed, as demonstrated in the fights with Takezo, Lord Saito, the dragon, and the spider, as well as some of the bounties and missions available in the latter sections of the game. This game's difficulty design is interesting to discuss because I would say that it's technically easier than something like Sekiro Shadows Die Twice when all things are considered, but it does have a higher degree of precision and perfection the player needs to attain for some of these more difficult fights. It's just that this perfection is off-balanced, with each fight being relatively short. Most are under a minute in a successful attempt, and the lack of punishment present throughout most of the game. Death usually just means trying a boss fight from the beginning again, and sometimes death Death can actually be a boon in the open world, as it can outright delete certain random encounters that are a nuisance during the exploration of Eizo's zones. All of that being said, there were a couple times in this game where I struggled a bit to progress, those being the Oni fight, the Takezo duel, and the final confrontation with Lord Saito. Each of these took quite a long time for me to finish, partially because of the sheer number of potential combo strings each has access to. Some, like Saito, get combo strings that I don't believe are present earlier in the game, which when coupled with insta or near instant death strikes, can be quite challenging. Because of how combo strings sometimes have delayed strikes in the middle of them and bounce between blue, yellow, and red coded strikes, which all have to be handled differently, it can be quite difficult to get them all straight in your head. Some strings can even be cancelled into different follow-up attacks too, forcing the player to counter what the enemy is doing upon reaction. Not being able to plan ahead or anticipate the enemy's next strike amps up the overall difficulty of the game quite a bit. This gets even more complicated when enemies have multiple weapons that they can switch between, inflating the possible strings they can do at any given point, especially since they can use their non-existent recovery frames after a combo to instantly switch and begin a new combo with a brand new weapon, which has to be responded with in a completely different way using a completely different weapon player side. And this gets even more complicated and even more dreadful when they block one of your attacks, cancel their recovery frames into a weapon swap, and then hit you before your recovery frames have finished. That being said, it's satisfying to start getting each of these strings down to on-reaction perfection, but it also necessitates multiple getting good periods over the course of the game's runtime. Most of the time, all of these elements come together quite nicely to make Ghost of Yōtei on Lethal feel like the right place challenge-wise. However, the attack suction aspect of certain enemy attacks that I mentioned in the previous section really does feel terrible and isn't compatible with the harder nature of Lethal. It's a tough thing to parse, as a samurai-style game should be rooted in perfection and insta-death style attacks. I think if the enemies didn't zip towards the player from time to time, or if they at least did it consistently enough to be something that the player can learn to accommodate their decision-making around, I'd have to say Lethal is just the right way to play Yotei, as is, Yotei's difficulty design isn't quite on par with how the average boomer shooter handles top levels of challenge, or how character action games like Devil May Cry do. It's not egregiously bad either though. I wouldn't have played through the game start to finish on Lethal if it were. 58 hours really isn't that much for the completion of an open world, but it's still a solid amount of time to play one game once through. Yotei's platinum process and open world design is strong enough to warrant this time frame. Yotei's combat encounters require the player's full attention, and this contrasts significantly with the vibe of the open world, which is far more calm in its pacing. Oftentimes, the exploration elements of Eizo and the activities therein are about bringing the energy down in the game, creating a sense of contemplative self-reflection, emblematic of the spiritual identity of Yotei's setting. Whether it be climbing up to a shrine in order to look at idyllic landscapes below, cooking food, or following foxes to secrets hidden in the wilds, all the activities in Yotei serve as character progression tools in a practical sense, while also functioning as character development for Atsu and space for the player to calmly self-reflect. The shamisen songs, sumie paintings, and hot spring soaks serve as contemplative activities that exist more in service of the game's setting and theming than raw gameplay intrigue. Most of the time, I'm all for games being super gameplay dense, where the player is spending all of their time enjoying the game's mechanics, whatever they may be, but these activities in Yotei demonstrate how the supreme dominance of gameplay density isn't absolutely necessary for all games. When dealing with art, nothing is an immutable monolith. These side activities, which can't even be called minigames because of how limited in mechanical design they are a necessary part of Yotei's setting and pacing. Without them, the game wouldn't feel right. There's a sort of magical realism that these activities add to Yotei that creates its unique identity, and as such, they're crucial components of the game's design, much like they were in Tsushima. This magical realism carries over to the way the player can use the wind to guide them to where they want to go, and what happens when the player shows deference to certain spiritual altars and nature sites. Personally, my favorite activities to come across after a hard-fought battle were the hot springs and sumie paintings. Japanese art is fantastic, and what I love about this particular painting style is the precise simplicity it's done with. This form of painting is connected to Zen Buddhism and requires a masterful implementation of brushwork, pressure, and ink usage. Just as in the spiritual expression, it's intended to be meditative, and meditation activities like this are necessary components of Yotei's design. Just like the brush strokes themselves on each sumie painting, these activities speckle Eizo in a balanced fashion. There's never too many at once, avoiding the bloated feel loads of Ubisoft-style open-world games often evoke. It's not like there aren't elements of the open world's design that do have action, suspense, and intrigue. Yotei adds a bounty board, which is one of my all-time favorite open world mechanics. I'm fairly certain Final Fantasy XII is the first game to have a mechanic such as this, and the way Yotei's works demonstrates a development of the idea over the past 20 years. Most bounties can actually be earned before accepting the quest line for them. There are exceptions, but most are accessible as just a part of Eizo. Finding and completing these without coming across their bounty posters is always a nice surprise, adding a lot to the organic feel of Eizo. The Sucker Punch team were possibly inspired by the monster hunting design of Witcher 3 as well, as several of these bounties can end in surprising ways. Some even can end with the player letting their bounty go because they learn that the reason for their bounty's existence is not born of malice or evil. A perfect example is how the player is tasked once to track down a Ronin, only to discover they've already suffered a mortal wound. The player can treat their mark to a final meal to ease their passing. Another example is how the player is tasked with hunting down Iwa the Beautiful, who killed a samurai. The thing is, Iwa killed a person who owned her and forced her to do terrible things, which means Iwa herself was a victim of injustice since slavery had long been outlawed in Japan by the time this game takes place. Slavery was outlawed in 1590, this game takes place in 1603. This quest is a bit ambiguous in regards to Iwa's status, as she could have been an indentured servant. Regardless, bounties like this add context to the social issues of 17th century Japan and further humanize Atsu. The questing matches this design ideology too. There's no journal or anything like that. Instead, the player has to speak to the people in towns in an organic fashion in order to find quests. Keeping track of where to go requires the player to look at their map instead of just clicking on which one they want to do from a menu. As a tangent about the map itself, I do love how raindrops will smack into it if the player opens it up during a rainstorm. It's a nice touch. This element of Yotei's design, how it incentivized the player to talk to random NPCs, just like vintage RPGs used to do, is crazy unique within the context of modern game design. One of the best ways to discover the locations of hot springs, fox dens, and things like that is to talk to random villagers and samurai who will then give the player a map to an undiscovered activity in the open world. This is something most open world games don't do, but it adds so much to the lived-in feeling of the world itself. It makes it seem more like the world is inhabited to have NPCs share hints toward things hidden in the world like this. Wolf dens are a new open world activity in Yotei and work in a pretty simple fashion. The player follows a wolf to a small combat encounter. It's a fun diversion, and once I even had a bear help me out during one of these. These wolf encounters play into one of Yotei's major themes, that a wolf needs a pack. Atsu is a lone wolf, and these wolf dens prompt her to help another lone wolf free its pack from the trappings of the Saito clan. In this way, the wolf, which I named Mikage, reflects Atsu's own predicament. This isn't the only way that open world activities reflect story ideals. When Atsu tries to learn how to dual wield katanas, the bamboo cutting minigame is used to demonstrate how hard she works to strengthen her off arm. The minigame in this particular case requires the player to use their left hand to complete it, which puts the player in the same position as Atsu. It's a nice touch that does come up again for one of the bamboo stands in Oshima Coast. I always love when games use game design elements to convey something about a character or story's theme, which are things that a sequel to Tsushima was always going to be expected to have. There's not an insane amount of depth to Yotei's story or anything like that, but it does have some interesting and cool elements. On its surface, Yotei's story is a simple revenge plot with the basic a wolf needs her pack theme I mentioned previously. Yotei has a more sensible revenge plot than The Last of Us Part 2, as Atsu's single-mindedness makes more sense, considering the fact that the Yotei 6 horribly murdered both of her parents right in front of her, and she formed her whole identity around that formative traumatic event. In this case, the ginkgo tree of Atsu's youth represents her. It's scarred but still growing, demonstrating how trauma, while leaving scars, doesn't kill us outright. It's possible for life to bloom in the smoldering remains of the past. The way the wind's use by the player is justified as the ancestors' guidance works within the bounds of this theme, and this is also true in regards to how music from the shamisen is presented as not a worldly thing. Fate dictated by wind isn't limited to just these forms of player agency either, as the Ainu tell Atsu about the goddess of wind myth and how she was punished for her own destructive power, which foreshadows the way Atsu nearly causes the destruction of her own potential future and happiness for the sake of vengeance. Small details like this, given in offhand comments, are not something most games would do in regards to any themes they have, but the understated nature of Yotei's deeper literary elements lines up with its classical setting. Given that Yotei teeters into the realm of magical realism many times, it's not surprising that myth and legend play heavily into the construction of Atsu herself. Twin wolves show up in Roman myth via the progenitors of Rome itself, Remus and Romulus. In that myth, Remus is killed by Romulus over a dispute on how Rome should be run, and this parallels the story of Atsu and her brother Jubei. As children, they bicker and tease one another constantly. In their youth, their parents referred to them as twin wolves, and this metaphorical identity carries into the present. When they take down the Oni, they are each building their own future. The caveat is that their futures are at odds with one another. For Atsu, her future is the conclusion of her quest, but for Jubei, it is a place of life and love for his daughter. The end of Yotei's story ends with Jubei's death. He's killed by Lord Saito, a situation he wouldn't have been in if it weren't for Atsu's quest for vengeance. In this way, Atsu and Jubei's story mirrors Remus and Romulus's because even though Atsu doesn't technically murder Jubei in the end, it is her actions that lead to his death. Within Ezo, wolves hold a place of spiritual and religious importance to the Ainu, who view them as envoys of their ancestors, or with reverence because of the fact that there's a wolf god in their pantheon. To me, this demonstrates, at least to some degree, that the Sucker Punch team are intentionally trying to draw a connection between Atsu's identity and iconic aspects of myth, both abroad and relative to Hokkaido and the Ainu themselves. It's not a perfect connection, of course, as the Ainu are presented almost as if they're dying out in this game, which is counter to historical reality during the time in which this game is set. I think it's possible the Ainu and invading Japanese are framed in this way to drive home thematic ideas regarding colonization. It would have been better served to lay the foundation for that idea in this game and revisit it in a third title that involves the complete subjugation of Hokkaido right after the Meiji Restoration, in my opinion. There's a Wild West vibe to this game sometimes though, which makes me think that it's also possible that the inclusion of the samurai and Ainu together during a time when they wouldn't really be better creates that tone, and at the end of the day, complete historical accuracy isn't always great for storytelling or game design. This is ironic because of how the entire Western genre of film was directly inspired by Kurosawa-type samurai fiction, making Yotei a fun inversion of these two slices of historical fiction. There is one element of the Ainu quest lines that I found particularly interesting. At one point, Atsu helps Huchi, a prominent Ainu within the game, find and save a budding bear cub. Bringing the cub back home, Atsu and the player learn that the Ainu will take care of the cub until it is grown. Afterwards, the cub, now a full bear, will be slaughtered so that its kamui can return to nature. While we might look at this with a raised eyebrow or disgust, I appreciate how we get to see a bit of Ainu culture within the game, even if it's more limited than it really should be within the historical time period Yotei is set. The animist nature of their religious and spiritual ideals is pretty well represented in this short quest. Something else I noticed about the Ainu that I found intriguing is the fact that all of their names are lowercase. This is unique because it is only Ainu characters that feature this grammatical choice, meaning it has to be intentional. Sure enough, it is. The Ainu consider their own names to be special and private, meaning they only share their true name with people they are especially close to. As such, the lowercase names within Yotei show that all of the Ainu are sharing their nicknames with Atsu, not their true personal names. This is even more interesting because the Ainu share their nicknames with the bear cub too, and I do wonder if they share their real names in private with the cub as a sort of closeness to the kamui. Yotei's story does have some real epic moments as well, such as when the twins execute the Oni, becoming unified through that baptism of blood. The entire construction of Yotei's plot pits Atsu's family and Saito's against one another, ending in the death of all members save one lineage each, the Onryo and the spider. While I can understand this decision from a thematic or plot structure standpoint, I don't understand why the spider would help Atsu find Koga Fortress at the end of the game, and the fact that he was abandoned by Saito doesn't work for me because of how much he loved the dragon. I suppose it's possible that he anticipated Saito going to Atsu's home, and this is all one final trick, but that's a tactic I'd expect more from the dragon. The spider never demonstrates that level of intelligence throughout the whole game. I can see the justifications for a few reads of this aspect of the spider's characterization, and while I don't personally like any of the ones I can think of, ambiguous elements of characterization are sometimes a boon to an individual player's enjoyment. I did spend some time trying to think through why the game's color identity is embodied by yellow and white, and what I think the developers are trying to convey with the cover of Yotei is how yellow represents divine power and mercy, and white symbolizes death and mourning. These two ideas make up Atsu via her connection to the myths of the land, and the basis of her identity being the savage murder of her parents. Atsu sparing the spider is something that is set up in a previous plot point, with the way that she spares Oyuki, the original Kitsune, once she learns of Oyuki's past as an innkeeper's daughter. Forgiveness is the antithesis of revenge, and I do like how the relationship between Atsu and Oyuki sets up a believable situation for Atsu to forgive a member of the Yotei 6. This also demonstrates the nuance that can exist in regards to an individual's place within an army, which is something that we all struggle with when viewing the heinous acts of a group of individuals. Oyuki best represents the metaphorical identity of her chosen position within the Yotei 6 too, as Kitsune are tricksters and shapeshifters in myth and legend. She wanted to blend into her environment regardless of who was around her, making this symbolic presentation of her identity work with her characterization. Considering Oyuki's place as a woman in a position of power, this chosen metaphor matches the reality of her living situation as well. Sexism is a definite part of Yotei. Thematic statements on sexism aren't as common as others might lead you to believe, but they do exist. Dojun, the Kitsune Atsu actually kills, weaponizes sexism to push Oyuki from power in the Nine Tails organization. He does so by painting her as a jealous, opportunistic, and power-hungry woman, which historically is how many women have been pushed from ruling positions. When all things are considered, I don't like Yotei's story better than Tsushima's. The thematic ideals and storytelling of Tsushima is better than Yotei, and this is partially because Jin Sakai is a more interesting character than Atsu. Atsu's behavior makes sense given the fact that she would have grown grown up during a turbulent time in Japanese history. There are moments in Yotei that are kind of cool. And I do like the thematic connections to mythology, but this story's plot could have been more complex, and it does suffer as a result. It does kind of remind me of some samurai and western films from the 50s and 60s, but I definitely would have preferred something more from a sequel to Ghost of Tsushima. Nothing about Yotei's ending matches the sheer emotional depth of Jin's final duel with Lord Shimura. Yotei's thesis that revenge isn't great doesn't really work because of the way the game presents Atsu's actions as being a net positive for Eizo. We'll talk about it in the next section because that's not really how this would play out if this was the real history, but we'll get to that in a second. If the Yotei 6 were far more morally complex when juxtaposed to the Ainu and the Tokugawa shogunate, this could have been a more interesting theme to explore in Yotei. But other than one element, which we'll talk about here in a minute, they're really presented as just terrible, evil guys. While some elements of Yotei's story are interesting in terms of metaphor and symbolism, the raw plot structure of the game is fairly weak. In historical fiction, games don't need to be 100% accurate. That's why it's called fiction, of course, but it is important for historical fiction stories to have some basis within the history of their chosen setting. Let's talk about that now. Complete realism is sometimes incompatible with historical fiction. There's a reason you should always go with history books to learn about a particular era over an artistic representation of it. Ghost of Yōtei takes place in 1603, meaning that the murder of Atsu's family happens in 1587, 16 years prior. This specific detail matters a lot because it confirms a few things about the Japan we get to see in Yotei. Yotei takes place in the boundary zone between the Sengoku and Edo periods. Lord Saito says that he was betrayed by Atsu's father at the Battle of Nagashino and or the time immediately following it, which happened in 1575. Given the fact that Saito lost everything, I'm going to assume that he sided with Takeda Katsuyori against Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu. This explains his fleeing to Eizo, which now goes by the name Hokkaido. Despite the Matsumai taking over the northernmost island within the context of Yotei, this doesn't actually happen until the 19th century, long after the conclusion of this game. The Ainu owned Eizo during this time, which makes me think that the very Japanese-looking shrines and structures, which seem to have weathered over the course of a long time period, are also in conflict with Yotei's temporal setting. Admittedly, I don't know enough about the Ainu or their ancient era architecture to know for certain, but it is something that stands out to me in retrospect. We do get to see buildings within the Nayoro Wilds, but I don't recall them anywhere outside of that small section of the map. As such, I don't want to say that's a definitive look at the full scope of Ainu architecture during this time period, because I'd be shocked if it were. This means that Atsu would have matured in the 1590s, and the reason I wanted to pin this down is that I wanted to figure out where she learned her proficiency with a blade. During the Sengoku period, there were always conflicts to participate in, and it is established in the game that Atsu mostly survives off the land, mainly via mushrooms and fish. This poverty is definitely consistent with the financial status of many Ronin at the time, and is something that would get worse after 1600. Because of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's sword hunt policy in 1588, Atsu would have at least needed to maintain the status of Ronin in order to keep her father's katana, and this could have pushed her into the service of a lord for a time. Perhaps this is why she is so anti-samurai within the world of Yotei itself. It's never mentioned in-game, but the Imjin War, which took place from 1592 to 1598, could be a reason Atsu knows how to fight as well. She does mention participating in the Southern Wars, which would include this one and Tokugawa's usurpation of Hideyoshi's princely progeny. After Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu would start the Tokugawa shogunate that would last from 1603 until 1868. This is when Yotei takes place, and this is important for a few reasons. Firstly, Ronin lost a lot of rights under Tokugawa Tokugawa's rule. In an effort to control the military might of the samurai class, Ronin lost several legal protections, including Kirisute Gomen, which allowed them to kill a commoner for any perceived disrespect. They were still allowed to carry their 2 swords, which is probably how Atsu gets away with it, but most would end up living in extreme poverty because samurai were restricted from joining a new master without their former lord's permission. This hampered a Ronin's ability to find legal employment, leading many to take up mercenary and bodyguard jobs. In this way, Ronin were often second-class samurai, looked down at with disgust and contempt, which could definitely have also impacted the way Atsu views the samurai. One of the biggest critiques leading up to Yotei's release is the fact that Atsu is a woman. Setting aside examples like Nakano Takeko, Onimusha, a female sect of samurai, did exist. It's important to remember that samurai history spans from the Heian period, which takes place from 794 to 1185, to the Meiji Restoration in 1868. That's approximately 1,000 years of samurai history, and to say that the legal status of samurai is complex, and that there were waves of political reformations during that time period is an understatement to say the least. As an example, Etsu Inagaki Sugimoto wrote in her memoir, A Daughter of the Samurai, that at the end of this martial class, it was seen as dirty or dishonorable to handle money directly, which is not a cultural feature of samurai throughout all of their history. Atypical people make for great characters in historical fiction. For example, Jin Sakai is unusual because he's willing to do what must be done, regardless of whether it contradicts the samurai way. Qingxi is one of the most famous pirates in human history, which is unusual because she's a woman. Atsu's position within the Ronin ranks reminds me of Deborah Sampson from the American Revolution. Mulan is a perfect example of my point as well, as she is a fictional atypical person for her era, and this makes her a standout amongst her literary peers. In terms of samurai's dictionary definition, that being those who serve, Atsu is a samurai by her deeds, her works, even if she isn't by legal deed. It's important to note that despite being patriarchal, which is itself not how Japan was necessarily in the ancient era, Japan does not follow the social rules of Europe. And part of what makes Japanese history so fascinating is how they buck so many historical trends from Eurasia. For example, conservative Christian ideals of sexuality and gender roles don't work in Edo period Japan because Toyotomi Hideyoshi cast out Christianity in 1587 with the Pateran Edict, and would begin executing practitioners in mass in 1597. This was done because of how Hideyoshi perceived Christian influence to be disrespectful of Japanese religions, such as Shinto and Buddhism, had concerns about European political influence in Japan, and because of the connection between Christianity and the illegal trade of enslaved Japanese people. For a long time prior, slavery was legal in Japan, but it was regulated, and this aspect of how Toyotomi viewed Christianity would lead to an outright ban of slavery nationwide. This is one of the biggest reasons why we don't see slavery in Ghost of Yōtei, outside of possibly Iwa the Beautiful's story. Once again though, that could just be a story of indentured servitude. It's not exactly made clear in that quest line. Instead, Japanese women were often expected to fight and kill, including themselves and their children if push came to shove. In terms of how the Ainu are presented in Yotei, it is true that the Ainu had historically been otherized by Japan through most of their interactions. The first example I could find goes back to 774, where the Emishi, who would become the Ainu, were demonized in the Nihon Shoki, in which the claim was made that Emishi men and women lived together promiscuously and held no distinction for father and child. Since some scholarship suggests that the Emishi were ancestors to the Ainu, this demonstrates the way in which the Ainu have suffered the subjugation of Japan over the course of 1,000 years, leading up to the events of Ghost of Yōtei in 1603, and their final assimilation in 1868. In the end, the Emishi would fall to cultural domination instead of military subjugation. The historical inaccuracies in regards to the Ainu are probably more the byproduct of Sucker Punch trying to make a fun game with a morally good side for players to align with, that being the plight of the natural-born denizens of Azo. With all of this considered, Ghost of Yōtei is historically based enough to warrant its existence as historical fiction, in my opinion. There are issues and things that should have been better, such as the presentation of the Ainu throughout all of Azo, instead of just limiting their primary residence to the Nyoro Wilds, conveying to the player that they are a dying people because of their artifacts being left behind as they flee more inland is also an issue in my mind, but maybe Sucker Punch knows something that I don't. Everything I know comes from history books, and there could be something lost in translation for sure. And that's my total analysis of Ghost of Yōtei, and is everything I've thought about as a direct result of the exact textual identity of the game. I'm sure this leads you, the viewer, with a major glaring question though. That being, why is the title of this video Political Propaganda Has No Place in Gaming? Being able to say everything about the game that I have already without needing to mention the discourse around it demonstrates this point. Political propaganda should never touch art analysis or gaming discourse, as the two things are incompatible in my mind. In fact, art analysis and critique is better without political propaganda, as it doesn't distract from a discussion of the game's mechanics, storytelling design elements, and identity. However, it is time for me to explain this more specifically. To say that Ghost of Yōtei has been under fire by the anti-woke crowd is an understatement. I personally think it's alright for any person to not like any game. I myself wouldn't call Ghost of Yōtei the best game of 2025. It would be in the top 10, but that's just not in line with how gaming discourse seems to be conducted in 2025. Seems like every game needs to either be the greatest thing ever made or it's irredeemable garbage, and I just don't play ball by that particular type of gaming discourse. If a creator is going to claim that Ghost of Yōtei is garbage, or the inverse, that it's the best game ever made, they need to defend that position with strong analysis and rhetoric instead of relying on lies and misrepresentations of the art piece in question. Last year, I put out a video taking a retrospective look at IGN's Alien Isolation review from 2014, one of the worst gaming reviews I've ever seen in my life. It's right up there with the God Hand review in my opinion. So when I say that the anti-woke videos, all of the ones I watched at least, are worse than either of those IGN reviews, understand that I don't say such a thing lightly. Regardless of how bad those reviews are, at least the reviewer writing the review played the game. It's not much, and is even less than the barest minimum of acceptable behavior from a professional, and yet it is still better than many of the videos released about Yotei leading up to and after its launch. Of all the videos I watched, there's only two where I could verify definitively that the person putting out the video played the game to credits, as they are the only two to actually use their own footage of late game areas. And there was one that outright said they didn't play the game and only watched the cutscenes. As if that's even remotely the same thing. Isn't this one of the key critiques that Gamergate was centered around? The idea that games media and journalists need to complete games before putting out their opinions about the value of the title? Where's the concern regarding full-time content creators who do this for a living being more unethical than the games journalists that existed at the start of Gamergate? Why are they immune from the expectation of maintaining a certain standard of integrity? Using trailer footage, social media posts, and mispronouncing key characters' names, you know, like Oyuki being pronounced Aoki, which isn't even remotely similar, are all telltale signs that someone hasn't played a game. And I think this is something that we should all be more critical of, regardless of what political side is being propagandized. Don't get it wrong either. I think it's perfectly fine for someone to look at a game via a sociological or otherwise politically geared lens to analyze the game from that perspective. I think it's important to look at games from every conceivable angle, but these political reads should be centered on things that actually happen in the game and be based on a complete view of the game that the analyzer personally played through. The point where I would say a political read of a game becomes propaganda is the point at which the game's elements are being misrepresented, misconstrued, or outright lied about to push a political narrative. Our world needs manipulative political propaganda to go the way of the dodo because we have a big problem with anti-intellectualism and pro-disinformation right now within the art analysis space, and this is always bad for pro-freedom sentimentalities. For what reason other than political propaganda does someone present a lie about a piece of art and then use that as a springboard to criticize modern American politics and politicians? Just food for thought. As such, I want to take a second to debunk some consistent critiques of Yotei that aren't valid. There are plenty of things someone could dislike about Yotei, and that's the exact reason misrepresentations and lies aren't necessary in video game critique and analysis. Firstly, there's literally no evidence that Atsu and Oyuki are lesbian lovers at the end of Ghost of Yōtei. In fact, Atsu barely forgives Oyuki for the massacre of her family. Just because they work together for the needs of the moment and Atsu is willing to start forgiving Oyuki doesn't mean that they are going to transition to a romantic role, and no scene in the game between them hints that this is a possibility. The fact that Atsu adopts her niece and raises Kiku with Oyuki is something many of these propagandists bring up as being the same as Ellie's goals in The Last of Us Part 2, which is just not true, especially since Ellie loses her family at the end of that game. This is a textbook false equivalency fallacy. The familial relationship between Atsu and her niece is incredibly different from Ellie's with Dina's newborn child. Kiku remembers and loves her father and is an active participant in her new family with Atsu at the end of the game. There's also no evidence that Oyuki will stay with them forever. She's there at the end, but she made it very clear in Yotei's campaign that she's a free spirit and likes to travel. Oyuki could stay forever. It's possible, sure, but even if she did, that once again doesn't mean that they'll be lovers, especially since Atsu recalls having physical relationships with men in one hot spring self-reflection. As far as I found, she exhibits no interest in women at all. Erika Ishii, Atsu's voice actress, being lesbian does not make Atsu so, and being able to separate actress from performed character is kind of a basic skill for analyzing anything artistic. There's a reason in literature that we have different terms for narrator, speaker, and author. They are not necessarily the same. Consistently, the brawl with the Matsumai samurai in Teshio Ridge comes up in these videos. What I don't understand about this critique specifically is that it ignores that no person could feasibly beat this many people at the same time, regardless of whether they are the strongest man of all time or not. Yet, realism doesn't matter until the player character is a woman. Throughout the entirety of Ghost of Tsushima and Yotei, the characters do things that are technically infeasible for a real person in their situation to do. Yet it is only in Yotei that a scene such as this is presented as a political statement, even though there isn't any evidence of that being something the Sucker Punch team were trying to do, killing literally hundreds of samurai, who are all men at this point because of the patriarchal structure of the military caste, which is something that will actually get more complex in the last section of the game because of Saito's social philosophies, is somehow okay, but beating a small group in a sake house when they are all presumably drunk is somehow not. This is a nothing burger of a critique that doesn't actually work within the context of how it's presented, especially considering the previous sections of the game. Why these propagandists use this scene over the one-on-one duel with the Oni's second in command, a big ol' brute, is lost on me. That other scene puts Atsu against the brute with a training weapon and still has her win, despite her opponent being completely sober. So I actually expected to see that scene in these propaganda videos. I was actually surprised to never see it show up. Criticizing that scene in the context of this argument would be stupid and fallacious too, don't get me wrong, but at least they could fall back on the physicality argument. I don't know any real gamer that actually cares about this point though, because I think we all realize that the characters we play in games consistently do impossible things, even within the realm of historical fiction. For me, the first thing I thought of with this scene is how Atsu gets out of consequences in regards to it in the the same way that Frederick Douglass does in his narrative, where he fist fights Covey. It's not unusual for marginalized people in history to get away with beating up the dominant force, as shame and embarrassment are strong influencing factors. No one wants to tell their boss that they can't handle the people that are supposed to be beneath them, especially if that person handily won whatever conflict it is. In one video, a content creator claims Atsu enters a brothel in a kimono to fleece men of their money at a gambling game, but this is an example of a disingenuous point. The part where Atsu enters the same gambling house as her mother did in the past is not the same event as when she played the part of a server in a sake house. Presenting that second scene as her wearing a disguise to enter a brothel is both a misportrayal of herself and of both situations. It's a gambling or sake house each time, not a brothel. Even someone who supposedly watched the cutscenes should be able to tell that these are not the same situation, especially since they are separated by hours, literally hours of content. The way the Kusarigama assassinations work also counters this point too, as the game recognizes that it wouldn't be right for Atsu to be able to pull a brute towards her with the Kusarigama. Instead, she cuts their throat from a distance, allowing their body to fall where it may. In fact, Tsushima itself is far more quote-unquote woke by the definition these propagandists typically seem to use than Yotei is. The most woke character in Ghost of Yōtei is actually the primary antagonist. He's not sexist, being even willing to employ and train women up in his army. Saito even offers Atsu a position as samurai, a noble station from which women were mostly barred, as we covered earlier. How is it then that a game where the primary antagonist's ideals would meet the propagandist's ideals of wokeness be woke itself? Isn't that a paradox? Or at least oxymoronic? Emphasis on moronic. His implementation of social changes such as these is the byproduct of practicality, the logistics of being the side with less manpower, political influence, and monetary prominence, and underdog by all definitions of the term. The problem, and why the political propagandists can't support the work despite this being something they could absolutely portray as a support of their narrative, is that the game puts a woman in the protagonist role. The English VA for Atsu is publicly Antifa, and they likely haven't even played the game, meaning their analysis is partially the byproduct of actual factual self-instituted ignorance. Now, if someone doesn't want to play a game because of the people who made it or act in it, that's their prerogative. However, that doesn't mean it's okay to lie or misrepresent the video game itself, or to make a video lambasting something you didn't even try to play. This isn't a Dragon Age the Veilguard situation either, where the writing of the game pushes modern ideals upon characters that are decidedly not a part of this era. This showed up in that game with the way modern vernacular regarding trans identity and acceptance were used in place of the terms that already exist within Dragon Age's mythos, demonstrating that the writers didn't understand the IP and thus didn't have the ethos to cover issues like these within the context of that fantasy world. Yotei is more nuanced with the way it uses its historical fiction genre to portray the themes it chooses to do so, as there are several moments in time where Atsu is forced to just take a sexist side comment without any direct recourse in which to address it, much like how women in the real world unfortunately have to do. There are times when she does get to put it to the man, but these are usually conflicts to the death. And are you seriously going to stare me in the face and try to tell me that smack talking doesn't prompt physical confrontations in real life? Are you going to, with a straight face, tell me that it isn't satisfying to make shit talkers eat shit in real time? Now, in 1603, it's possible that the Tokugawa shogunate might have been considered an improvement over the Sengoku period of civil war that Japan was finally getting out of. They were the essence of stability, at least. However, regardless of what side the player could possibly assist, shogunate, or Saito, the end result is the colonization of Ezo and future erasure of the Ainu civilization and culture. How exactly is a game where the end result of the player's actions is eventually going to lead to colonization within the historical fiction framework of Yotei's narrative woke? Isn't that the opposite? This is exactly what I mean though. Regardless of whether this fictionalized version of Ezo during 1603 would get colonized or not, it is is possible for players to read the game in that way, and something that forces the player in the position of pro-colonialism, even for the Tokugawa shogunate, which did add major stability to Japan for a long time, is not in line with the politics associated with what these propagandist pundits call woke. As I said before, killing Saito actually sets back any chance of women entering into the highest echelon of the ruling class, which is also against the tenets of what these people call woke. In the Edo period, women faced incredible restrictions on their freedom, rights, and education. Women within rural communities did fare better, but that's for the same reason women would be pushed into stable jobs during the Great Depression and World War II in the United States. It was necessary for the survival of the family, given the financial reality of their sordid situation. In the Edo period, women were second to men and were limited in terms of property ownership, marriage choice, and social, physical, and financial movement throughout Japan. This is the side that wins at the end of Ghost of Yōtei as a direct result of Atsu's interactions with Saito's forces. Once again, I ask, how is this woke exactly? To me, this seems like a valid presentation of the historical theme of Yotei's setting, an acceptance by the creators that some elements of history are impossible to be completely reversed by one person. Atsu doesn't change the course of history for Japan during the Edo period. All she does is maintain the status quo and the original passage of time. And this final thing is a tangent, but watching these videos was honestly painful at times because the gameplay on display was incredibly poor. One even played a tutorial section as bad as Dean Takahashi did that Cuphead tutorial in 2016, except they did it unironically. At least in Takahashi's case, he knew he was being bad at the game when he posted his infamous failure and only did so as a self-deprecating joke that just fell flat. I do want to be clear though that I don't think someone's take is invalid for playing this or any game at a lower difficulty level. It's just that I find it hard to buy the idea that the gameplay in Yotei is bad when the people saying so apparently can't grasp simple mechanics and choose to play in a poor and boring way. The truth of the matter is that Ghost of Yotei's statements about the world and gameplay are complex, requiring a deeper nuance than woke or not, which is just not in line with political propagandists' way of doing art analysis and discussion. And that's the real end of the review. And on this channel, I always end my reviews by answering the same question: will this game make my top 100 for the decade of its release? Ghost of Yōtei is not a perfect video game. It's no 10 out of 10 or even 9 out of 10 experience. And I would say that after finishing the title on Lethal with 100% completion, that I have definitely played better games both this decade and decades prior. It is, however, going to make my list as the 71st entry in the 2020's top 100. It's going in the blue category because I don't think this game is going to remain on the list all the way to its final, especially since there's been a higher volume of great games coming out since 2023. The game isn't as good as Tsushima in my personal opinion, but it is also not bad, not even close. Yotei is the 187th game from the 2020s that I've played, which actually kind of shows you how weak the first few years of the 2020s were. I've had a full base list of 100 games with every other decade by the time I've reached 150 games played, but I am confident that my final 2020's top 100 is going to be pretty solid. I mean, I haven't had the time to even touch Age of Empires 4, which looks amazing, and I haven't finished Hollow Knight Silksong yet. And that's the video, my guys. What do you think of Ghost of Yōtei? How do you think political propaganda has impacted gaming discourse? Let's discuss this game and everything around it in the comments below, and while you're down there, consider smashing that like button, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. I make new gaming videos every Wednesday and Friday covering loads of modern and vintage games, and you may like my other and future work. Hyping up this video is a great way to ensure that other people have the opportunity to see it. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games. Have an awesome day, dudes.